Okay, I think this is live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to my workshop. My name is Olivia, and I am one of the Deputy Chief Adjudicators for Tallinn Euros, which is happening in 2 weeks' time. And I am also one of the Chief Adjudicators for Scottish Euros, which is happening in about a year. But we're still very excited. I'm going to be running a workshop today, which covers essentially a checklist for winning, 7 argumentation mistakes to avoid. And a couple of things to say before we jump right in. The first thing to say is I'm going to be aiming this workshop at a lot of different levels. So whether maybe you're going to your first Euros, maybe you're not going to Euros, but you are preparing to go to a couple of international tournaments over the next year, this workshop is for you. If you're going to Euros and planning to break or hoping to win, then hopefully there's parts of this workshop that are for you as well. Second thing to say is I have made slides for this workshop, and you can find them if you go in the description. Hopefully they're useful. You can follow them along or check them out afterwards. Obviously, this workshop is going to be recorded as well, so that might help. And if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to put it on the live chat on the side. I'll try to answer questions as we go along. Send me a message on Facebook if I'm not answering, and I'll just check it out. Great. So as I said, and as says in the introduction, I'm going to be covering 7 argumentation mistakes to avoid. At this point, it's only 2 weeks until Tallinn EUDC, and it's therefore probably not a very good time to drastically change your methods, drastically change your prep time strategy, or drastically try to learn about something completely new that I've never thought about before, never strategized about before. What it is, though, is a very good time to refine your arguments and spot the reasons that you've been taking those really frustrating fourths when you thought that you were winning, that were completely unjustifiable, and make sure that that doesn't happen to you at Tallinn Euros. So 2 pieces of advice before we start. The first one is, this is a non-exhaustive list of some of the most common mistakes that I have seen. These are mistakes that I've committed when I was speaking. These are mistakes that I've seen when I'm judging. So what I really recommend is that you sit with your partner for Euros or for whatever tournament, and try to think of examples where you have made some of the mistakes on this list, right? Go back to the last 2 or 3 tournaments that you guys have done together, try to identify, oh, when did we do this? Have we ever done that? It's likely that you've done at least a couple. Spot them so that you can prevent them next time that you see that you're making the same mistake or falling into the same traps. But equally, make sure that you're calling out teams that make these mistakes, right? Make sure that you are extending on a team by pointing out, they have this hole in their case, this is the bit we're going to fill. Or make sure that you point these things out in rebuttal, because hopefully there's a couple of useful tools that it will give you. I'll give you guys one other tip in terms of what to do between now and the 2 weeks that Euros is happening. Again, 7 mistakes can be quite a lot. 7 big errors can be quite a lot to try to fix in 2 weeks. Is that, again, you sit with your partner and try to identify your key weaknesses and the key areas that you need to work on. What's the best way to do that? In my opinion, something that has helped me a huge amount in the past is to make a list of the different rounds of the last 2 or 3 tournaments that I have been to. Try to remember the results that you've taken, maybe write them down alongside. So for example, you might say, Vienna IV, I took a 1st in round 1, a 4th in round 2, a 3rd in round 3, all the way down. Then ask yourself, for each of those rounds, at what point did you realize that you were taking the results that you ended up taking? For example, did you never realize that you were winning or losing? The call caught you completely by surprise. Did you realize halfway through your speech when you were running out of time, you realized that you weren't going to be able to cram that final really smart argument that you had? Was it when your case was rebutted and you realized that you hadn't protected it enough? Was it in prep time, when you realized that you and your partner were fighting, or that you weren't getting to the real core of the debate? Or was it maybe when you saw the motion and you thought, crap, I know absolutely nothing about this, we're going to lose this debate? The reason this is really useful is that once you've done that, once you realize at what point in the process of the debate you realize you were losing or you realize you were winning, now you already know what your weak part is, whether that is economic motions, if you realize you were losing when you saw that the motion was economics, or if it is time management, if it was halfway through your speech, or if it's being able to judge the debate, if it caught you by surprise, or if CO's rebuttal to you was the thing that really meant that you were losing that debate. So something that I would recommend is don't try to do everything I'm saying in this workshop, but ask yourself, what is the key priority that I need to work on, and together as a team, and prioritize that. Hopefully that makes sense. Having said that, I'm going to jump right into the 7 mistakes that I would recommend. These are things, as I said, that I've seen quite often. And in case you're just joining, you can see the slides that I'm using in the description. So, slide 1, the first mistake that I see happen really often at all levels, from absolute beginner debaters to people that have been debating for a very long time, maybe if you're trying to argue too many things or if you're in a bit of a rush or taking things for granted, is describing where an argument exists without actually making and fully proving that argument, right? A good rule of thumb is that if you're making an argument in less than 2 minutes, you're probably not proving that argument in detail. And very often you do have judges saying things like you need more analysis, you needed to spend more time on that argument. And very often people just don't have a clue what that means and what to do with that information. When judges tell you that you need to spend more time on that argument, it doesn't literally mean spend 2 more minutes just describing it, saying the same things all over again. It means you're missing some key premise. And here is very often what I find is the thing that is missing. So something that teams do very often is they start an argument, they explain it, they ask why questions, they develop it, but they stop too soon before they explain it fully. In particular, very often they stop when they think that they have reached a conclusion that is self-evident, that is obviously good, that is obviously bad, but that actually isn't self-evident and it actually hasn't been proven. What are some examples of what this might look like? Very often, these are narrative debates. When you have teams making arguments such as, we shouldn't have unlimited immigration because it's going to lead to a backlash and more people will become racist. Okay, racism seems harmful, but the problem is that you need to compare it to other harms that other teams are also going to be able to prove in the debate. And to me, it's unclear, for example, if there's one guy who's racist, but he's racist by himself, living in the middle of the desert, he doesn't intuitively harm anybody. So that is not a harmful outcome in itself. What you need to do is take a couple more steps and explain, what's that racism going to do? Why is that racism relevant? What harm is it going to lead to? And in what way does it change people's lives? Equally, you have arguments that say, this policy will give a platform to the LGBT movement. Great, but what are they going to do with that platform? What is the end goal? Surely it's not just speaking for the hell of it. Surely it's what you can reach as a result of that platform, right? Or as a final example of narratives arguments where this happens is in a lot of international relations debates where teams often say arguments like, this policy will send a message to Putin that his actions are illegitimate, or it will send a message to China that the West opposes or of its behavior or something like that. The question here is, what is this message? How are you going to communicate it? What harm is it going to lead to? Legitimization is a very vague thing. So you always want to try to explain what consequence in the real world is going to follow from it, right? If you don't do it, you're labeling an important question, you're correctly pointing to where an argument is going to be, but then you're not answering that question that you've provided. You're not explaining what this harm has to do in the debate, and you're requiring the judges to do the work for you. If you make this mistake, it's going to be very easy for other teams to extend on you by filling this gap and explaining why this outcome isn't just value neutral, but why it is morally good or morally bad, right? Another example of this is principles debates. Very often, I guess it's because philosophy motions or philosophy principles seem quite abstract and wishy-washy. Very often teams feel like they can get away with doing a bit less logic, and very often as a result they stop too early thinking, well, this is obvious. For example, you might have an argument that says we should allow unlimited immigration because borders are arbitrary. Fine, yes, they probably are, but why does the fact that something is arbitrary mean that that thing is bad, right? If I roll a dice, the result is arbitrary, but that doesn't mean that the result is immoral. Or another example would be if you say, this policy is unacceptable because it will lead to the same crime receiving different treatments and different kinds of punishment. Okay, this is an argument that was made at a Euro semi-final. It's an argument that's made very often at a very high level when you're saying, oh, if we, I don't know, have special crimes or special added punishment for hate crimes, crimes that are committed with a particularly evil intention behind them, then the same crime can have 2 different degrees of punishment depending on who committed it, depending on the circumstances. That goes against the principles of the law, therefore we should oppose it. That is a great argument, but it isn't a complete argument because you're not explaining what is the value of those principles, why are they worth pursuing. Very often principles in human rights and things like that are things that we choose to have. They didn't fall down from the sky, according to most people's theory of rights. They're things that we choose to have because they improve people's lives. So even with these kinds of arguments, it is useful to try to tie it to an outcome, or in whatever other way you want to, explain why that is a principle worth upholding. Why is that an important outcome? I'll give you two more examples. You might have examples where you stop an argument when you stop too soon, once you've reached a value-neutral outcome. So again, an argument that has been made in debates that I've been by very good debaters are things like, a certain policy in the developing world is going to lead to more small businesses being able to develop and compete with large multinational companies. And they stop there. And again, that is a very powerful argument. That is an incredibly important point that can be made. But it's not self-evident why small businesses are better or as good as big multinational companies. And you're relying on the intuition of the judges to fill in the gaps and understand, yes, this is an outcome that is worth it. You need to take one or two more steps and explain, here's the things that small companies are likely to do that larger companies are not likely to do. For example, maybe they have more knowledge about the area. For example, maybe they have more of an incentive to hire locals. Anything like that is a crucial part of that argument, and otherwise it's incomplete, because you've proven that something will happen, but you haven't convinced the judges of why that something is good or is bad. And therefore, it might work for your side, or it might equally well work for the other side. And the last example of this is having very generic outcomes, right? And this happens quite a lot at all levels. Very often teams stop at saying things like, this will help improve the economy, or we should make voting compulsory because it will increase democratic participation. Again, great argument, great headline, but you need to explain what are the benefits of improving the economy, what are the benefits of democratic participation, right? Very often, when I try to explain this to people in feedback or so on, they think that I'm talking about impacting, that you need to impact your arguments. That is to say, tell the judges why your arguments are so important that they win the debate. Impacting is really important, but this is kind of the step before impacting, right? It's proving that a certain outcome will happen, that a certain thing is bad, and then after that, impacting is the next step. When you explain the fact that something is bad, is relevant for the motion, is enough for you to win over the other teams in that debate, okay? So this is the first very common mistake. The question is how to avoid it. With narratives debates, when you're showing there's going to be more racism or more tolerance or a platform for a certain group or more feminist people or anything like that, always try to link that to a practical change, a shift in perceptions that eventually leads to practical outcomes, or explain that it's the only way that a marginalized issue or group can get exposure, which means that eventually you get awareness, and what outcomes can that lead to long term, right? It's very useful to try to say, not only we're going to have more feminism, whatever feminism means, but we're going to have the outcomes feminism wants, which is more rights for women, whatever that may be in that specific debate. With principles debates, you want to show that it's a principle we share, that it's something we find morally abhorrent, it's a principle worth upholding. And if you want some more tips on this, there's a workshop on our Scottish Heroes channel by Alex Harris on principled argumentation, which can be really useful. But there's one thing that all of these arguments have in common, which is they all require specificity, right? You always need to take one step further and explain in more detail, why is this bad? Who is it going to affect? It's not necessary for winning, but it's incredibly helpful, is to always try to go for a group of people that you can describe, that the judges can touch, that the judges can picture, and explain how you're going to be able to help them. If you can refer to the context or the words of the motion, that helps you explain what makes them relevant, in what way these people are the most important ones, in what way they're particularly going to benefit or particularly going to suffer. So that's the advice that I would have, is to avoid this mistake, to avoid this problem from happening, is always push yourself one step further, and after you've proven that something will happen, ask yourself, why is this a good thing? Why is this a bad thing? And very often this means asking yourself, what is going to change in the world? Who is going to benefit? Who is going to suffer? Being as clear and specific as possible can help you, and asking yourself, A, who suffers or who benefits? How big of a group is this? Why is this group a relevant one and an important one? And secondly, what is the currency of that harm? Okay, for example, it could be happiness, it could be quality of life, it could be financial, it could be political power, it could be a huge range of things. But you can describe that harm in a lot of detail, explain how long or severe the impact is going to be, if it leads to further harms or consequences. And this will mean that it's very clear to the judges exactly what you have proven and why it's something they need to take into consideration in the debate. So they can't ignore it, even if other teams are proving other things and other benefits. So that's what I would say about the first mistake. I was going to say, are there any questions? And I do see some things on the live chat, but I can't quite understand what it says. So if you want to ask any questions, please keep typing them there, and I'll keep looking at it and adding what I can. Moving on to the second mistake that I see very often. The second mistake is showing that something is possible, but not showing that something is probable. And again, I see this really often. So what do I mean by this? A couple of examples might be whenever you have teams arguing things like in opposition, aha, but what if the government is corrupt? They might use this policy to their advantage. Or what if this council deciding this is very racist? They might use it as a discriminatory tool. A slightly higher level example of this is if you're making an argument about building social housing in high wealth areas. Okay, very often an argument in this debate goes, well, building social housing in high wealth areas is going to allow rich people to befriend poor people that otherwise they rarely meet. And this will end discrimination because you have more interactions between people. Okay, there's a problem with both of these arguments, which is, okay, so that could happen, but why would it happen, right? What makes it more likely than not? For instance, yes, now rich people are more likely maybe to bump into people from from sort of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, from more disadvantaged backgrounds. But why does that mean that they will interact with each other? There's a huge lack of causation explaining that. What are other examples of this? Very often you have arguments that say we should ban gambling, for instance, because poor people might lose a lot of money and get stuck in poverty, which seems like a fairly clear harm. But again, the question is, do they? Does that happen more often than not? What is it about people in that background, in those circumstances? What is it about gambling? Maybe the way it's advertised, maybe something about their incentives that means that this is going to happen more often than not. Or a final example that happens very often is when you have teams saying, for instance, that we should censor the media in times of war, because otherwise you will see a lot of your soldiers dying in war, and that's the body bag syndrome, and that's going to make you pull out of wars that you should stay in. Here, there's a question of, how much is that going to happen? Can you prove that causally? But also, why is it that more often we should stay in wars that we would end up leaving, rather than we should leave wars that otherwise we wouldn't end up leaving? So essentially, what do these things have in common? Firstly, you're, again, providing an interesting question, but you're not providing any structural means for generating answers to that question, for generating answers that benefit your side and that benefit your case. So you're assuming that something is going to lead to something else without providing any analytical, structural, or basic causation to that argument. So you're saying that something is possible and leaving it to the judges to say, yeah, no, that sounds like that could happen. Why? More often than not, this is going to happen rather than the opposite. So this is something to look out for. And what's the best way to avoid it? The first thing I would say is characterizations are very important. These are the kinds of arguments that rely on you describing the group of people that you talk about in a lot of detail, describing their incentives, describing their background, describing the information that they have, the abilities that they have, and what they want to do, and therefore saying, more often than not, they're going to act in this way as a consequence. For example, if you're trying to make the argument about social housing, one team is going to say, most rich people aren't evil. They are going to be willing to talk to poor people. Here are the reasons why you have a lot of discrimination. Here are the reasons why you have a lot of class against people from different backgrounds. Now, when you live together, you eliminate those reasons. For example, you have a perception that people from a different background don't work very hard. Now you see them working hard every day. Or you have a perception that they're all God knows, violent, dangerous, taking drugs, and now you see them interacting with their children at the shop right next to you, or their children are with your children in school, and it's very awkward to explain to your child why they're not allowed to play with a certain kid or go to their house after school. That degree of detail helps convince the judge that that's quite likely to happen. Whereas if on the other side you say, actually, that's unlikely to happen. If you are a person from a disadvantaged background that is suddenly plunked into a neighborhood in which you don't know anybody, where you don't have the financial means to go to the same shops as people from a wealthy background, to go to the same exclusive schools as people from a wealthy background, those interactions aren't going to happen, and you're going to find yourself isolated in that community. Consequently, you don't have the opportunities for positive interaction that the other side talks about. Okay, this is an example where both sides are doing more work than in the example I mentioned earlier to show that something is probable, and the side that does that best is the one that wins. And very often teams miss this causal point and take something for granted, leaving themselves open to being attacked afterwards. This is where example tennis happens in international relations debates. Every time you have a motion and some teams are saying, we should have sanctions because here it turned out well, or we shouldn't have sanctions because here it didn't turn out well, these are teams that are not doing this, that they're not explaining why something is more probable on their side than what the other side is saying. So this is something to look out for, and always ask yourself, how can I find a structural explanation for this and explain something about the words in the motion, the context we're talking about, the people we're talking about, that shows that this is going to happen often rather than only a one-off case that we don't need to worry about. Okay, so that's the second mistake to look out for, something that you want to try to avoid doing. The third one is very closely related to this. And this is something that very often if teams do this, then it's also going to be incredibly difficult to you to try to prove any causation to the things that you're saying. So the third mistake is exaggeration and generalization. And I'm not talking from a sort of, obviously generalization is bad from an equity lens as well, but I'm talking exclusively from an argumentative lens. What are the kind of mistakes people make, and why are they unpersuasive? In terms of generalization, I think it makes sense to start here. Very often, teams will make some arguments that require a very blunt way of looking at the world or of looking at a specific group. These are arguments like, we should ban religions from influencing politics because religious people are irrational. Or more benevolently, perhaps, assuming that you had proof that God did not exist, this house would hide the information or something like that. You might say, well, religious people depend on religion for, a meaning of life, so they would be distraught, and it's very evil to take that away from them. Or equally, you might have arguments that say we should give welfare as vouchers rather than as money because otherwise poor people spend it badly and they stay in poverty. These are examples where fairly clearly someone is talking about a huge group as though they had a lot of things in common, when in fact, they probably don't all act in that way. In fact, perhaps only a minority act in a certain way, perhaps none at all. And it's quite obvious that that's a problem. But think of another example where it's a little bit less obvious. This policy will help women. This will give a key platform to LGBT people so we can have more LGBT rights. This suffers from the same problem in that you are trying to claim a very large impact to a very large group of people without explaining what makes that group a group. In what way can you guarantee that all women or all LGBT people want the same thing? And this kind of generalization happens very often in debating, even when it's completely benevolent, even when it has nothing offensive behind it, it's mostly just wrong. And the problem is that we like to group people into things like being minorities, being women, being prisoners, being voters, being LGBT, refugees, conservatives, ISIS fighters, the poor. There's a huge list of groups that we use for people. We need to have groups so that we can talk about people in a shorthand way. But you want to, whenever you're doing it, explain what makes a group a group. Okay? They probably share common interests. What are they? In some ways, they will be homogenous and they will have things in common. But in other ways, they won't be homogenous and they won't have things in common, okay? Women can come from incredibly different backgrounds and have very different priorities or experiences of what feminism is meant to be. Even conservatives, political conservatives, want to conserve different things. Poor people, people that are stuck in poverty, are there for different reasons, and they have different priorities. For example, like very simple example, if you're poor and unemployed, you might want lower minimum wages so that you can get a job. But if you're into a job, if you're poor and in a minimum wage job, you want that job to increase so that you have more money to do nice things with your family or nice things in your free time. Okay, so all of these groups are invariably going to have a huge amount of divisions between them and a lot of things that they don't share. So whenever you're talking about any of these groups, you need to explain what characteristics they share, make sure those are relevant characteristics, right? And then characterize them in a certain way and say, well, if you are in poverty, the one thing we know is that you don't have money, and you probably want money because money can help you do all of these nice things. So therefore, you have an incentive to improve your situation. How can we predict that you will act as a consequence of that, right? And what inevitably this means is that you can't talk about religious people as a group. You can't talk about women as a group because they're going to want completely different things in any debate. And any argument that tries to claim we help women or even we help prisoners is unlikely to be very persuasive, because there's no way you're going to help all of them. And you're assuming they have characteristics that they can't all have. This is fine. It is absolutely fine for you to pick a smaller group that has things in common and then defend why you're benefiting that group. For example, admitting openly is fine to say, we're not going to help all women. We accept maybe this policy doesn't particularly prioritize advantaged, privileged women. We are fine with that because we think they have a lot of other tools to improve their own situation. What we do say is that this policy helps the most disadvantaged women. For example, women from certain minorities that don't get enough space in feminism at the minute, women from working class backgrounds, single mothers, right? Pick any example of group that you're talking about, explain why that's a relevant group, what is it that they share, and then link that to the motion and say, aha, well, this group matters because they're all in that situation. Here's how we're going to help them. That is a much, much more compelling way of arguing. And in hundreds and hundreds of debates that I have judged, the teams that win are the ones that can be the most nuanced and the most specific about the groups of people that that they're helping, because it's a very concrete benefit that you can picture, and it's easier and more plausible to prove. So don't be afraid of saying, we're not going to help everybody, we're going to help a smaller group, but we're going to help them really, really well. The second thing to say here is this doesn't only apply to when talking about groups. Exaggeration happens in a lot of different kinds of arguments, and it is something that you should run away from, okay? Very often you have arguments that try to be a little bit too ambitious and bite off more than they can eat. So they will say things like, this motion is going to end poverty. This motion is going to lead to World War III. Those are a bit exaggerated, but you do more often have things like, we will end the Israel-Palestine conflict. We will fight and end sexism. We will achieve equal rights and equal treatment. And the question here is, are you sure about that? I mean, this is just one policy existing in a world with a huge amount of other policies, with a lot of intrinsic bias, intrinsic discrimination, whatever you want to talk about. It's very unlikely that this one thing is going to be enough to change the world. Okay? And very often in debating, you have a choice. You can either choose to run with an argument that has a very big, very obvious impact, so that if you prove this impact, you're obviously winning the debate. For example, ending the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? No one's going to beat you. If you manage to prove that, then you're automatically winning, because that is such a huge deal, unless the other side has something even bigger. God knows what it would be. Are always going to be harder to prove, and there's a chance you end up with nothing, because it is a little bit implausible. On the other hand, you have the choice of going with something smaller that is easier to prove, like, you know, actually this is a key time in political negotiations, and we can tilt the balance so that a decrease in hostilities is more likely. That's a very relatively humble argument, right? It's quite a small impact, but it's much easier to prove, right? It's a smaller burden to take on. And then it doesn't mean that you automatically win. It does require more work. It requires you to explain why the other side is exaggerating. They don't get their benefits. And it requires you to explain why actually, in the context of everything else that might happen if we don't do this, this is a very big win. but that is an argument that is far more plausible and is far more proven and less vulnerable to attack. Very often you want to go for that argument. So don't overstate your impacts. Teams will laugh at you for it. They'll be able to strawman you and not rebut you properly, and you're likely to end up with nothing on the table. I'll give you an example of where this happens at a relatively high level, okay? You might have an argument about the European Union unifying the history curriculum, okay? I saw this debate recently, and we had a team in Open and Government making a very good case saying, right now, there's a huge amount of tension in the European Union. There's a lot of xenophobia, there's a lot of Euroscepticism, there's a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of divisions between North and South, East and West, Eurozone and non-Eurozone, etc. We therefore need to foster a sense of unity, so we're going to create a unified curriculum that'll fix it. What's the problem there? You've spent such a long time emphasizing the degree of the problem, right, comparatively, and saying here are all of the reasons why there are tensions, right? Let's say you talk about the refugee crisis. You talk about the fact that Germany has too much power. You talk about economic imbalances, right? Let's say you have those sets of arguments. You're then creating a very large problem and a context in which you're making a very small difference, right? The history curriculum isn't intuitively very important, so you're going to have to do a huge amount of work to show that it's going to be enough to fix the problem that you've outlined, right? There's a problem-solution mismatch in size. So there, you probably need to be a little bit more humble about the impacts that you're going to achieve and say, clearly, there's a lot of things going on. There's always going to be some degree of, I don't know, populist anti-EU parties. The question is, this is a particularly good time when people are willing to reconsider, when we're getting some momentum for the opposite view, we can help that. Or we can mitigate that, or we can provide the only voice against populist parties in Europe that exists. And that suddenly becomes a much more persuasive kind of argument. So how to avoid this mistake? Firstly, don't be afraid to pick a small group. Don't be afraid to pick a small harm or a small benefit. Secondly, be aware of moving pieces. Be aware of everything else that exists in the world, all of the reasons why there are problems, and all of the reasons why the thing that you're trying to solve might still exist, why people might still be racist or discriminate regardless of this policy, why people might still behave in a way that causes problems. Acknowledge those, and don't try to say you're going to change those things as well, but explain why actually the one change you're bringing is the key one. It is enough to override those things that stay constant and is going to make a significant difference just by itself. And the last thing that I would say is be careful with how you do this and how you differentiate people or decide who you're talking about, because there's two fairly bad ways of doing it. The first one is people often differentiate people by saying things like, oh, we're not going to end racism. We're not saying we're going to end racism. What we're saying is there are some people that are really extreme racists. We're not going to change their minds. But there are some people that are in the middle, sitting on the fence, and we're going to make them change to our side. And then there's some people that already agree with us. We're going to make them agree with us even more, which is fine and an interesting way of deconstructing things and breaking things down and understanding the world. Except it's used in so many debates, and it's used in a fairly generic way that doesn't look at the words in the motion, doesn't look at the actual group of people that we're talking about, and isn't linked in any way to the problem or the specific belief that you're trying to solve. You could take that argument and run it in. So that doesn't mean that it's a bad argument, okay? Judges shouldn't discredit an argument just because it's generic, because it might still apply and it might still be more relevant than other things in the debate. But it does mean that it's very vulnerable to attack and that it's likely to not be as persuasive or as compelling as if you can look at specific words in the motion in the group that you're talking about and describe them in a way that is more compelling. And I mean, as an example for this, if you look at the speaker scale, and you look at what's the difference between 70 and 75, 75 and 80, 80 and 85, going up the scale, originality is something that is rewarded in things like rebuttal and the kind of arguments that you have. It's very important that you are generating benefits that are specific to the motion, because they're more likely to be proven, more likely to be concrete, and harder for other teams to refute than if you have a stock argument that could apply in any instance. And the second thing that they look at is something that I'm going to move on to in a minute, which is leaving your arguments unprotected. The teams that do best are the ones that push the other team to respond on a lot of different levels with very sophisticated responses. So I'll get onto that in a second. But I want to say one more thing about this, and then if anyone has any questions, please type them. The last thing I want to say about the way that you characterize people and exaggeration and generalization, how it can be a problem, is I am not saying, and indeed you shouldn't, just toss in, and this helps vulnerable people at the end of the debate, okay? I can't count the number of debates in which I've seen teams go, and in particular, this helps the most vulnerable people, or this is a very important argument because it helps the most vulnerable people. And they very often leave it there without explaining people, why are they vulnerable, and why are they vulnerable in a way that's relevant for this motion, right? So you need to also persuasively characterize them and explain what their circumstances are and why that means that we need to help them and that they need some form of support or another. And lastly, you need to explain how you help them and in what way their situation changes. So for instance, there's a huge difference between saying, we are going to help women are the most vulnerable, so they will disproportionately benefit from whatever this policy is, or saying, this policy will particularly help people that haven't had this help in the past and therefore are lagging behind. Very often, these are women. Very often, these are people from minorities. Here's how now they get the one thing they were missing, and here's how they can improve their life in the long term. I don't have a specific example for that one, but hopefully you see what I'm going for. So summary here. Don't exaggerate your benefits. Characterize persuasively, look at the words in the motion, look at the context, and try to draw arguments out of that. Very often it's there to help you. And don't just toss in vulnerable people, explain why they're vulnerable, in what way they're relevant for this debate, and how you're going to help them. Okay, so those were the first 3 big mistakes to avoid. I have had a question, which is, any debate video suggestions? That's a tough one. There's a lot of very, very good debate videos online. I would recommend starting with a lot of Worlds and Euros finals. A lot of them are like not just finals, but quarterfinals, semifinals, and so on. You can find a lot of them online if you just search for EUDC and then whatever year you want. I do have a list of other debates that are useful, and I can try to put it on the description afterwards or in one of the comments. Otherwise, send me a message if I forget. And it depends a little bit. It depends what you want from it. There's some motions that have an example of very good PM speeches, or examples of very good rebuttal, or just very good debates on international development. So there's a lot out there, but I'll try to send you a list of some that are, I think, particularly good. Okay, so moving on to the 4th mistake. As I mentioned a minute ago, it's leaving your arguments unprotected. And what I said earlier is the teams that do best and the speakers that get the highest speaker points very often are the ones that build their argument in such a way that it requires a very high level of rebuttal to take it down. So don't make the mistake of waiting for the other side to attack you before you rebuild your own argument. Don't forget to think of what the opposition is going to say during preparation time and try to wing it and think of it on the fly. You always want to expect what the other side is going to say and start fighting on that right away. So within this, I have 5 pieces of advice. I'm going to have some water first. Okay. Piece of advice number 1. You must expect the other side. You must always, in preparation time, ask yourself, what is the other side going to say? And importantly, where is the trade-off going to happen? Okay. You don't want to, for example, spend several speeches defending why democracy is really good if they're never going to contest where democracy is really good, but instead they're going to contest whether you achieve more democracy, right? So always ask yourself, where is the other side the strongest? What are they most likely to try to say in their speeches? Whenever I was preparing with my partner, very often we would take 2 minutes sort of in silence, thinking by ourselves, and then rather than saying, okay, what have you got? What benefits do you have? Let's have a list and then decide what we say. The first question we would ask would be, what is this debate about? What is the trade-off? That's not only what am I going to say, what are we going to say, but it is what are we going to say, how are they going to respond, and how do we beat them on their own ground? So it's good to always be aware of what the trade-off is going to be, where the disagreement is going to happen, and where the other side is going to be at their strongest. How do you identify this? Practice is often the best way. And what I would say is that in a lot of motions, it's quite obvious. Let's take an example. This House believes that governments should be allowed to spy on people without their consent. I think if you stop and think for a second, what does prop say? what's their main argument, and what does op say, what's their main argument, it's fairly clear that it's going to come down to security versus privacy, and to what extent spying on people can help you meaningfully gain a security advantage, versus to what extent that's an unacceptable intrusion on people's privacy and people's freedom, right? So what you want to do is you want to ask yourself this question in preparation time. Let's say you're an opening government, and then immediately, right from the start of the debate, you want to start arguing, 1, where you're going to achieve meaningful security, 2, where you're not going to have a meaningful loss of privacy, and thirdly, why security is more important than privacy. So if you have to have a trade-off, your argument is more important. Okay? You want to essentially start minimizing the importance of what the other side is going to say right away, from the start of the debate, from the start of your speeches, so that they have to do extra work to even make their arguments start counting by the time that they go on to speak. Second piece of advice: preempt attacks on your specific argument as well. Push yourself for more detail and push yourself for one more why. So one of the most useful pieces of advice that I got was, whenever you're building an argument in preparation time, imagine for a second that you're closing opposition and ask yourself a point of information. What is that point of information that destroys your argument, destroys your case? Now fix that argument so that that point of information doesn't work anymore. Sometimes I find that hard to do this for myself. So I try to chat to my teammate in advance and try to find a dynamic where if one person is describing an argument and adding things to it, the other person is asking why this, why that, and filling in points of rebuttal, okay? This isn't very interactive, so I can't do it now. But a useful exercise is to think of a motion, think of an argument, deliver it just with 2 minutes prep time, something like that, then stop and spend 15 minutes thinking of as many pieces of rebuttal to that argument as possible, all the reasons why that argument falls, all the things that haven't been explained. Then 10 more minutes, switch back and try to rebuild that argument so that those criticisms don't work. Okay, this isn't the same thing as preempting rebuttal or pre-buttal as most people do it. So this doesn't mean you should stand up and say, opening opposition are going to say there's going to be a backlash. Here is why there's not going to be a backlash. But it means integrating within your argument changes and ways to develop it so that that rebuttal no longer works or is no longer convincing. Very often this does mean adding caveats, adding characterization, adding more explanation of the group of people that you're talking about, maybe picking a smaller benefit or a smaller harm than the one that you had at the start, okay? But short version is, always ask yourself in preparation time, how is the other side going to attack this? And then change that argument so that that attack doesn't work. And essentially, you're making yourself bulletproof, and you're forcing the other team to take 2 or 3 extra steps if they are to refute that argument. You might want to ask yourself why the things you're saying are true. Does it always happen? Can you think of examples for that? That can be quite helpful. Third piece of advice is you want to insulate your argument with a sort of even if, which is to say, even if you're not proving your argument all the time, is there a way that you can protect yourself so that even proving it sometimes or adding a degree of uncertainty can still be useful? This is done quite bluntly sometimes, to be honest. For example, sometimes teams say, but even if this argument isn't true, then it might be true one time, and if it's true one time, then it's such a big impact that we win the debate. Or even if we're not creating more safety for, say, vulnerable LGBT people, we're sending the message that we support them and that we stand on their side. So even if there's a backlash, it doesn't matter because we tell them that they matter, or something like that. And these are not very good examples of adding an even if. Why? Because you're adding a new argument at the end, but you're not justifying that argument in the same way as you justified your main argument, right? So you've only provided justification for your main impact, which is, for instance, why a certain policy would guarantee more safety, guarantee more rights for LGBT people. And then you're saying, but even if not, then we have a different benefit. Moving on. So you need to make sure that that second part also has some support and also has some indication of why that's a valuable outcome, an outcome that matters to LGBT people if they're not having their rights protected, for instance, and explaining why that's going to be important. Okay? Why is the illusion of safety important in itself, even if we don't achieve safety, for instance? And I'll give you an example of where you can do this well. Let's go back to the spying motion. The motion, let's say, is the government should be allowed to spy on people without their consent. And you're saying, aha, if the government is online and on people's phones, then we're going to be able to prevent a lot of terrorist attacks because we are going to be able to spot attacks before they happen. Now, an obvious attack with that is, no, terrorists are just going to move somewhere else. They're just going to go offline and chat on the streets or use code words. Okay, that's a very obvious response. You can preempt that in opening government and say, yes, we know that sometimes terrorists will just, before they get caught, they will pass on a message, they will realize, they will use code words, so they will go somewhere else. But this is still a win for our side. Why? Because it means that we're creating inconvenience and we're creating more steps that any terrorist has to take before they commit a terrorist attack. Why is this important? This is important, or a useful outcome, because it gives us planning time to track their activities some more before they get to carry out their attack. Perhaps it gives us more evidence if they suddenly start using sketchy behavior, or perhaps it just discourages people from attempting terrorism at all, which, given that there's a very delicate balance of harms and benefits between whether you choose to join a terrorist organization or you don't find it worth it because there's too big a risk, maybe this is enough to put you off, think, give you enough time to chat to your family or your imam one more time and think about it, right? So that's an example of adding an even if, but explaining why that even if is actually an even if rather than, oh, but safety is important as well, without explaining why. Okay? Fourth piece of advice here. As well as having an even if, which is adding a degree of protection to your argument and insulating yourself against attacks, you can also do the opposite. That is to say, add an extra benefit to your argument. Very often, arguments have a secondary level of impact, a second benefit that you could add to it at the end, and very often teams don't exploit it and they don't take advantage of it. For example, very often, let's say that you have an argument that says, this policy is going to benefit the economy. Well, that's great, but perhaps benefiting the economy also helps improve the political situation because it reduces political instability or populist parties, okay? Maybe if you empower poor people more and give them more financial support, that means that you're also improving the economy at large because you have more people at work. Maybe if in the developing world you get more women to go to school or more women to enter the workforce, that is important for women and for women's rights and for their quality of life, but it's also important for economic development because 50% of the workforce that were previously excluded are now able to join. Maybe if you improve the quality of housing that people in disadvantaged backgrounds have, it's great because they now have better housing, but it also means they can focus more in school. So you can reduce social mobility long term, okay? There's a lot of ways that you can do this. I'm not going to go through all of the examples, but it's very important that once you think you have proven something convincingly, you don't miss potential benefits that could follow from that. Some are more important than others, and obviously you need to make trade-offs in debating. But once you've taken the time to prove something, rather than proving something else completely from scratch, it can be useful to just make sure you're milking and taking advantage of that one thing you've proven in a lot of detail and explain why there's secondary or tertiary benefits, and those are also important. Careful clarity of your case, because then your case becomes vulnerable and dependent on one single premise, which isn't ideal. But if you know that you have a premise that is already well protected and that you're pretty comfortable in, then it's a very useful tool to add at the end. And one more piece of advice on why you shouldn't leave your arguments unprotected and how not to do it is something I see so often, even at the highest level, is people and teams that fail to add, rebuild, and reconstruct after rebuttal. So deputy speakers or summary speakers that forget to support what their team partner said. So of course everyone does rebuttal. Very few people forget to do it completely. But as well as rebutting what the other side has said, you need to also make sure that you're picking up on what your partner said and the rebuttal that the other side gave it and explaining why that rebuttal is insufficient. Okay? In fact, this is the single role that deputy speakers have to do. They have to push the debate forward while reframing, repackaging, and developing the arguments that have been made before. The best way to do that is by explaining why the rebuttal to it misunderstood the argument, wasn't taking it at its highest level, or fails for whatever other reason, okay? Whenever I'm in deputy or whenever I'm in summary, I never repeat everything my partner has said. That's a very silly use of time, and you do need to move the debate forward and add something new that hasn't been said before. The key way to do that is to develop the most important parts of your partner's arguments and the parts that have been attacked and made vulnerable by the other side. So what's important is that you chat to your partner very clearly after they sit down to speak. Very often I say, have clear notes of what arguments your partner said, have clear notes of the rebuttal that the other side gave your partner, and then make sure that you have a very clear explanation of why that rebuttal fails. A lot of times I've lost debates because I forgot to do that for my partner, or my partner forgot to do that for me, and it's really frustrating. So you're not done speaking, or you're not done debating when you're done speaking. That is when you need to make sure that you're writing down the rebuttal to your points, because you know what you said and you know what you missed, and then pass that on to your partner. And then if you are a deputy or a summary speaker, make sure that you don't forget to prop up what your partner said. Teamwork is incredibly important in debating. So I'm going to move on to the fifth piece of advice in a minute, but before that I have a question. So what does it say? If the debate concerns groups or systems you know relatively little about, for example the Court of Justice of the European Union, is it useful to draw upon analogous groups in order to analyze the debate? So analogies and examples are incredibly useful, and actually something that I would say as a rule is you always want to have 2 or 3 examples. Why? Firstly, it grounds your case in reality, so it makes every argument that you say seem a little bit more likely. 2, it makes sure that you're not going off the wrong track, because if you can't think of examples, then you probably have an argument that's going to be quite tricky to prove and maybe not hugely relevant. So it can help you stay on track. But thirdly, why do you want to have 2 or 3 examples? Because if you only have 1, it's very easy for the other side to say, oh, well, that one example that they had is completely irrelevant because clearly the US is a very different legislative system. So moving on. And that's very frustrating when you're an opening government and closing opposition says that to you and you can't respond. So you always want to have several arguments. But on the point of analogies more specifically, analogies can be useful, but you need to make sure that you always explain why it's relevant and why it functions in a certain way. If you are faced with an institution that you know nearly nothing about, let's say it's the ECJ, the IMF, the World Bank, some convoluted organization like that, you try to work out what things you do know, and you might know them because they must be true. For example, they must be pretty bureaucratic, because what does bureaucracy mean? Bureaucracy means that you're checking things, right? That you're holding yourself accountable. And that means that things go slowly. Or it must mean that perhaps, I don't know, perhaps it's likely to favor people that are the most enfranchised or the most advantaged. For example, it's likely to have a bit of a European or a US bias. Why? Because to have sufficient qualifications to be able to make it to a top job in one of these countries, in one of these organizations, you're likely to have studied in institutions that they recognize, that are most globally esteemed, etc., etc. And then you can draw things out of that. So equally, and you really don't know how it functions, ask yourself, well, in what way must this institution function? And thinking of other comparable institutions is quite useful. I wouldn't actively flag the ECJ is like the European Union. What are problems with the European Union? Because that is prompting other teams to say, no, it's a completely different institution. Here's 2 or 3 reasons why they're likely to be different. But as long as you can justify why you're making safe assumptions, why you think they're likely to be similar, then yes, it can be a good strategy to think of relevant arguments and think of how you're explaining it, to say, well, these institutions are likely to have a lot in common. They were set up around the same time, set up for the same reasons. Therefore, what assumptions can we make? That's kind of what I would say. Let me know if that's unclear or if you have any other questions. So that was mistake number 4. Moving on to mistake number 5. This is so long. Engaging at a shallow level. This is something that I see, especially, I would say, at the top level. At the top level, I don't know what happens to debaters. After you have a couple of breaks, you just decide, I am a god and I don't need to spend any time rebutting other people's miserable little arguments. And people just forget about rebuttal, and they forget about rebutting at the level that it's meant to be. So some tips on this. First thing to say, this applies at every level, perhaps mostly at a lower one, is rebuttal can be a lot of different things. People very often speak of rebuttal, and judges treat rebuttal as though rebuttal exists or doesn't exist, or rebuttal works or doesn't work. It's convincing or isn't convincing. In fact, rebuttal can do a huge amount of things in between. So for one, it can be mitigatory, right? Mitigatory. That is to say, it's not showing that something is never going to happen or showing that something is going to do more harm than good, but showing that something won't have as many benefits as the other side claims that it does. This is the majority of rebuttal, probably. Two examples that I've put on the slide, which you might be able to see. One is, we shouldn't increase inheritance tax because rich people will still make their children rich while they are alive. So even if we get rid of inheritance, then we're still going to have inequality. Fine, that is useful mitigation, but that doesn't answer the question, well, maybe it's still getting a little bit better. Maybe we're at least inconveniencing them a little bit. Or that what that does is it makes it very easy for proposition or opposition to stand up again and say, okay, but here's why the inequality that comes from inheritance is a particularly bad kind of inequality, okay? I was in this debate once, you can see it online, and I was in opposition about having this as would introduce 100% inheritance tax, and this is what I tried to do. So rather than saying, well, we shouldn't have 100% inheritance tax because there will still be inequality, what I tried to do was to say, we're going to have worse inequality. Why? Because inheritance tax comparatively only causes a huge, in the majority of cases, it causes like a passing on of wealth at a fairly late stage. So usually when you're in your 40s or 50s. So at that point, you've kind of already made it. Whereas if you're passing on a huge amount of wealth while you're still alive to your children, you're likely to want to make sure they have a safety net. You're likely to want to pass it on to them when they're children. And that means that you're ensuring they own a flat when they're young, they make it to elite universities when they're young, therefore removing opportunities from children at a point in which they could compete with it, and imposing inequality for the entirety of their lives rather than only from when they're 50 years old, for instance. It's not a perfect argument, and there's a lot of things wrong with it, but that's an example where I try to go beyond mitigation and show this is going to be a net harm. Not only you're not going to get all the benefits you claim. This isn't to say that you shouldn't have mitigatory rebuttal, but you need to be aware that logically, you're still letting the other side have more things than you do. So you need to pair it up with some harm, or you need to do something else that rebuttal can do, which is to be decisive. Okay, rebuttal can be completely decisive and convince the judges this is never going to happen. This is, going to be, it relies on a premise that is not proven at all, that is very counterintuitive. You've convinced me of the logical opposite of what the other team was trying to say. This is unlikely to be the majority of your rebuttal, and be aware that it relies on the other team to have made a mistake, because it's very difficult to prove something is decisively untrue. But that's rebuttal that can be very persuasive. But there's something in the middle that rebuttal can do, which is it can shed doubt. It can convince the judges that maybe something will or will not happen, but they're not certain that it's likely anymore. Or maybe something will have some gains, but probably not as many gains as the other side said. But there's a couple of problems in these cases that you need to be careful about, okay? The first thing is you need to be very careful about doing something that we sometimes call whataboutery. And that's the second example that I've got on the slides about social housing. So let's say that you have a piece of rebuttal which says, Open and government are saying that social housing, if we put it in high wealth areas, is going to help integration, but they never prove that rich people will ever want to talk to poor people. Moving on. As I said, I mean, that's a very valid point. And if OG hasn't proven that, then they're in a tough spot. But that kind of rebuttal is shedding doubt in a fairly shallow way and is very, very far from decisive. That is to say, you're asking a question, which is, oh, but why will that happen? You haven't proven that perfectly, but you're not providing an answer for that question that works for your side. Okay, you are saying, OG haven't proven this logically to perfection, but then again, that's not the burden in debating, because you only have 7 minutes to speak, or 14 minutes, or 10 minutes to speak. So it's very difficult to prove anything perfectly. You need to do more than that and convince me, give me a reason for the opposite. Give me a reason for why the opposite of what they said is true, rather than they haven't proven this to perfection. But also, if you rebut this way, you're allowing the next proposition speaker to stand up and say, great, I'm going to prove exactly what they said we didn't prove, and now we're winning the debate by their standards. So you always want to answer, not only ask. You want to say, they haven't proven that rich people will want to talk to poor people. The reason they haven't proven it is that the opposite is true. Here is why you will have more discrimination, or you will have continued discrimination. That is a much more persuasive kind of rebuttal. If you want more on this, by the way, Owen Mooney's workshop, which is also on our channel, is great. I'm trying not to repeat things that he said, but they are very useful if you want a little bit more on what effective rebuttal is. But a couple more tips to say on this. So what does good and effective rebuttal look like? In my opinion, again, trying not to repeat what Owen said. Firstly, you want to win within the other team's terms. That is to say, the most effective kinds of rebuttal are the ones that take the outcome that the other team is trying to prove and wins even on that metric. So for instance, if one team says an argument, we're going to help children, it's important to not only say, well, we're going to help women, children don't matter, or whatever weird example you're talking about. I don't know what motion this would be. But you also want to say, fine, they want to help children. Here is why, in fact, they're harming children. Here is why, even by their own metric, by their own framework of what matters in this debate and what is enough for them to win, they are failing to meet that goal. And in fact, we are better meeting that goal than they do. This kind of rebuttal is the most effective. So always make sure that you're not only trying to show why the other side is irrelevant, but also trying to win within their own terms, trying to get into their territory and help their people more than they help those people. That's a very convincing way of rebuttal, in particular if you can make it substantive. And very often your material is going to be inherently responsive. So point this out and explain that actually your logic helps their people more than they actually help them. Second thing to say is attack where the argument is going, not where it has gone. This kind of relates to the whataboutery thing I mentioned. Don't just say they haven't proven something. Give me reasons for the opposite. And also take them at their best and don't take the weakest line of analysis that they had, or try to present their argument as being something that it really wasn't. Most judges are good judges and they take detailed notes and they will notice if that's what you're doing. So it's generally not advisable. And the last two things to say on rebuttal. One thing is, engage on several responses is a very good tactic to make sure that you're protecting yourself. So even if one of your pieces of rebuttal doesn't fly, one of the others will, and the other team is on a back foot and they have to respond to several things. So don't rebut everything. Not everything deserves your lengthy rebuttal. Not everything is decisively proven and relevant to the debate. But if there is an important argument from the other team, and there will be at least 1, 2, or 3, rebut it on several levels and have several responses, because that means you're protecting yourself and at least one of those is likely to stick and the other side has to respond to several of them. So I always try to have 3 reasons for why something isn't true, and it helps protect yourself. And lastly, as well as explaining what the other side isn't true, you can also explain why the other side isn't important compared to your benefit or compared to your harm. So having this combination of trying to have decisive rebuttal, trying to mitigate and make their harm very small, but also comparing it to yours and explaining why, even if they're helping children, it's not an important group in this debate, it's not very relevant, it's not a very big harm, is a very good strategy to adopt and something that will help you win against all sorts of teams. Okay, 2 more common mistakes to avoid. And as I said before, keep letting me know if you have any questions at all. The next one, it's a slightly more higher level one, and it's a little bit tricky to explain, but hopefully it will make sense. And that is missing argument interactions. So mistake number 6 is missing ways in which your arguments don't exist in isolation, right? Your argument is part of a debate and it's part of a case. So ideally, you don't want to have a long list of benefits. You want to have a case that works together, a sense of what's important, a sense of what principle you stand behind, a sense of this matters, that doesn't matter, this matters, that doesn't matter. So your arguments inherently will interact with each other. And your arguments will interact with other things that other teams have said in the debate. So you need to be aware of the implications of your argument. There's a lot of moving parts in the debate, and the teams that win debates the most are the ones that have a better sense of how their arguments interact with each other, what they need to prove to win. And there's a couple of mistakes that happen when you're not aware of this. Biggest mistake number 1 is internal inconsistencies and internal concessions. And this happens so ridiculously often, and it happens especially in characterizations. So very often a team will say at one point in rebuttal, I mean, you're saying that this policy is going to have a great impact, but people just don't care that much about it. And then secondly, in their arguments, they'll say, we're going to have this great impact, people will be so angry, there will be such backlash, or something like that, right? Or you have arguments that say, actually, this is only going to affect the minority of cases. And then secondly, you'll have an argument that says, you know, people will suffer and this will escalate into bigger problems, which relies on the idea that this isn't the minority of cases, but is actually going to happen quite often. What do these things have in common? One argument requires one premise, and another argument requires the opposite. You can resolve this if you're talking about even ifs, sometimes something will happen, sometimes something else will happen, but sometimes two arguments are inherently contradictory, and the more you prove one argument, the weaker the other one gets. So you want to be careful with this. What's a great example? The history debate that I mentioned earlier is one of those examples of unifying the history curriculum in the European Union. There, you have an argument that says, there's so much tension and so much inequality and so much conflict within the European Union at the minute, which is, a fairly compelling argument with a lot of examples, say, and then at the same time an argument that relies on the idea that it's so fickle and it could change at any moment. So a policy of unifying the curriculum can be enough to change that. That's a very difficult balance to thread, and the more you strengthen one part, the weaker the other part gets. Another example would be, let's say that you have a debate about a female James Bond or Atomic Blonde, which is happening for real, or a female Doctor Who. You might have an argument in favor of it, that says, people aren't going to care very much. It's not a very impactful thing, so you're not going to have a backlash as rebuttal. But then that also weakens the impact of your argument, which is to say, this is a very powerful role model. A lot of people are going to care about this. So you're essentially reducing the proportions on both sides. So you need to be aware of that. That's not to say you can't do it, but just that you need to be aware of where you might be contradicting each other and what bits you want to strengthen and what bits you want to emphasize a little bit less. The way you resolve this is by having a sense of team line and chatting to your teammate and making sure that you agree on principles. Another example of this happening is principle debates, or any debate in which you get a point of information on your principle and you might get asked, aha, would you also support this? And that's because you haven't thought about what consistent theme line you're going to go for. I'll give you a really embarrassing example, which I really shouldn't say online, but anyhow. I was once in a debate at my first Euros on a motion about giving the Israeli diaspora a vote in Israeli elections. At this point, I wasn't very knowledgeable about international affairs, I'm ashamed to admit, but then again, those who know me will know. So I stood up in PM, not knowing very much, saying, Israel is a different kind of state. There's a different kind of relationship. You have a kind of obligation to, defend the state just because of your religion, regardless of where you live. It's not a traditional social contract. Something that sounds kind of reasonable if you don't know very much. And I get a point of information from someone who went on to be the best speaker in Europe, Ben Adams, saying, would you also force all the entirety of the Israeli diaspora to enter conscription? Or to be conscribed, essentially into the military, conscripted. And at that point, I realized I had set up my principle in a way that would then be inconsistent if I said, no, I wouldn't, because I had said you have all the obligations as though if you lived in that country, et cetera, et cetera. So what I didn't do was to have a clear sense of, this is what I will defend, this is what I won't defend. So I ended up with a huge unnecessary burden. That meant I took a third. I'm surprised it wasn't a fourth, to be honest, of defending, yes, they should also do that, because unlimited obligation, something, something. So the piece of advice here is, try to identify the very thin line that you want to tread and agree with your partner on either what principle are we defending, what broad stance are we going to use to defend certain examples that are then thrown at us, or other analogous situations if they're thrown at us. But secondly, in other examples, be aware of what premises you think and what characterization you're using for the debate. If you're agreeing that the debate happens mostly in the developing world, you also need to imagine what's going to happen on the other side in the developing world and whether that's actually worth it for you. And you need to be able to bite those harms as well, is an example, right? Second problem here, which again is a little bit, I'm going to use an analogy to explain this, and I have to credit Elliot Pallett and Ed Mancy for this analogy, which is very useful. And this is a strobe streetlight argument, and it goes as follows. At the minute, you have a lot of people with epilepsy who suffer a huge amount, and we don't have enough awareness and we don't have enough political capital to help them. Not enough resources are dedicated to their cure, to their treatment, that sort of thing. So therefore, we defend the policy of having strobe streetlights that go on and off all the time, because this is going to mean that their suffering is going to be so visible to everybody that you're going to have a huge increase in political capital to help them. So they will suffer so much whenever you have the street lights on outside that people will care enough to try to fix it. Okay? This argument is clearly, I like to think, absurd and quite cruel to force someone to go through so much suffering because of a benefit of political capital. But this is the same kind of argument that gets made very often. For example, yes, this is going to lead to a backlash, but that backlash is good because it's going to lead to, think pieces responding to it. And we're going to raise awareness of how much racism there actually is, or how much intolerance there actually is. Or for instance, it's very good that we have documentaries that portray struggles of certain minorities, even if they're not perfectly accurate. Why? Because they lead to more think pieces that respond to those documentaries, and therefore you end up with more awareness. Okay. That are not inherently, broken. Like, you can make them really well and win with them, but they're inherently the kind of argument that is going to be easier to refute than it is to make. And it's a very weird kind of argument that says bad things are good things because they make us aware of the bad things. And it ignores the fact that you're creating more bad things. You're creating more racism. You're creating more harmful portrayals. Okay. How can you spot whether you're doing this or not? This happens when you're so focused on achieving a certain outcome that you forget the reason that that outcome is valuable. For example, you very often have teams, the racism examples that I gave you of the documentaries are quite good ones. When you say, no, the thing we want is the narrative about racism, and you forget the reason racism is bad is the people racism affects, and the people have to live with it, right? So that's an inherently tricky argument to try to make, and one that ignores how's the other side going to respond to this. Clearly the harm is falling more on your side than on theirs. But another example would be if you're talking about conflict. Very often people say things like, yes, we're going to say end the Israel-Palestine conflict. We don't care if people die in the short term as long as we're ending the conflict. And you forget the reason conflict is bad is because people die in the process during conflict, right? So you need to do more than that to explain why your cause or your end goal is worth the means. Now, this is why I said I was going to chat about wastelands and peace, because that's what it is. You are saying that peace is valuable in itself, even though you're creating a wasteland. That is to say, you're so focused on your goal, be that achieving a narrative, having more awareness about racism, ending a conflict, that you forget about the reasons that that end goal is important. And therefore, those kinds of arguments are likely to be very uncompelling and are likely to be easier to rebut than they are to make. So don't feed the other side things that they can use to laugh at you, and don't try to go for impacts that try to make a bad thing a good thing because, for example, we have awareness of the bad thing, right? So it's a very common problem, and one that I think requires a lot of work to make those arguments win debates. So be careful with it. So that's mistake number 6. There's no more questions. I'm going to move on to the last mistake, which is mistake number 7. And then please let me know if anything is unclear or you have any other questions that I haven't addressed so far. The last mistake, to try to tie things all together, is not thinking like a judge. Okay? Very often, going a little bit meta here, but the teams that win or lose debates depends very much and correlates very closely with how much teams are judging the debate as it goes along and predicting the debate before it happens. So strategy is very useful. And what I'm saying here is, please always assume that the judge is judging according to the rules and is a good judge that is going to listen to what you say. Don't change your tactics based on prejudices around your judge, because that's likely to backfire against you. Remember, there are wings in that room as well, and they do get a choice and that sort of thing. So bearing this in mind, what do I mean when I say you need to think like a judge in debating? What are the kinds of things that you need to do? The first thing I would say is you need to focus on the logic. Even before the debate, ask yourself, what sentence, if I convince the judge of this sentence, means that I win the debate? So rather than asking yourself, how many benefits can I list? How many times can I say, this helps minorities, this helps children, this helps teachers, this helps parents? There's only so much that's going to be relevant for you as a shopping list of benefits. Maybe those are not very important benefits and you're not explaining why they are. Maybe it's more persuasive if you can tie it together under a bottom line of, we're going to prove a certain thing. We care about a certain group of people. We care about resolving a certain problem, and tying your arguments as subpoints that lead to that thing. Okay, so again, in the example that I gave of the government spying on citizens without their consent, you probably need to prove 3 things. And if you prove those 3 things, it's going to be very difficult for other teams to beat you because they're fairly central to the debate and fairly comparative. 1, that you achieve meaningful gains in terms of security. B, that you don't have meaningful losses in terms of privacy, and C, that if we're comparing the two, security is more important than privacy, okay? Obviously, there's other arguments you can say, but thinking in terms of a case rather than in terms of arguments is going to help you quite a lot. You need to ask yourself, what is the logic of your arguments, and how are judges going to judge it? Is there a premise that you've taken for granted? Is there a causation that you haven't explained? Essentially going back through some of the things in this list and working out whether it's something that you have done or haven't done, have proven or haven't proven. The debate. Arguments are strongest. So both which of your arguments are logically the most important and the ones that you need to spend the longest on, but also you need to track the debate as it goes on. You need to, especially if you're in closing, you need to decide, is opening government beating opening opposition? And therefore, do I need to explain why I'm beating opening government? Or is opening opposition beating opening government? And therefore, is it a good strategy to make my extension essentially a point of response to what opening opposition are saying? Very often when I'm coaching or when I'm judging, if I sort of, as an exercise, ask teams afterwards to write down the call of the debate on a piece of paper and give it to me, they're very surprised and they don't know what to say. And they say, well, I wasn't judging. I don't have a call. And that should never happen. You should always judge the debate as it goes along, track it, you know, what arguments are strongest, which ones do you need to focus on? And equally, you need to ask yourself how the arguments play out and what you need to do to win. Logically, debates are going to be comparisons and trade-offs between benefits and harms. So you need to make comparisons to the judges. And you need to make sure that you are not only mitigating, but you're actually defeating, right? Remember, mitigating logically is not going to be sufficient if you don't pair it with a harm, or if you don't pair it with some, explanation of why their benefit is very small or something of the sort. So focus on strong arguments. Make sure that you're logically thinking of why this is enough to beat the argument, rather than rebutting to fill your time, or because you're very tempted to give a certain very clever line, or rebutting an example which isn't rebutting the logic. Okay? So think logically, choose your extension accordingly, choose your rebuttal accordingly as well. Second thing to say here is judges are subjective humans, and we are likely to be swayed. We want to be swayed, and we want you to help us decide which teams are winning or not. Okay, we don't use, I guess, speaker scores while listening to your speech to decide how good is your style, how good is your structure. We are happy for you to explain to us logically why you're winning and help us make this decision. And judges will be looking out for things in your speech that help them justify why you are taking it over other teams. And when they listen to other teams, they're also looking for things that help them justify why those teams take it over you. So this means two things. And these are the last two things I'm going to say unless there's any questions. So use your time and ask me any questions now. Thing number one, impacting matters. It's not enough to prove why an argument is true. If you don't then tell the judges why that argument being true means that you win the debate. Telling the judge how to judge the debate is really important. So saying things like, they had this argument, we took it down in these 3 ways, so it's not true. But even if it is true, at best, they have this benefit, which applies only in the minority of circumstances. By comparison, you have this argument of ours that applies in the majority of circumstances. 3 reasons why it's more important. And you can impact in this is a different workshop by itself, but you can impact in a wide range of different ways. It's not only saying these people are very vulnerable, but it's saying things like, there's a bigger size of harm. There's a bigger length of harm. It's long-term rather than short-term, which means that it applies for longer and helps more people. Or maybe it's short-term rather than long-term, so it's more certain. And it's our top priority because we might come up with other solutions for long-term problems later. Or perhaps it leads to further benefits or further harms that need to be taken into consideration. Or perhaps we have a moral obligation to prioritize a certain benefit or harm because we have a duty to certain people. Okay, there's a wide range of different ways you can impact. But the thing that matters is tell judges how to weigh different things in a way that works in your favor, obviously. And it can also be useful to tell judges what they can and cannot credit and what parts of certain arguments have been discarded, don't fall in the debate, how the characterization has changed and therefore works in your favor rather than in the other team's favor. Okay, a good example of this would be if a team in a debate relies on a premise that they haven't proven very well. For example, they only want to debate in the developing world, and you have done enough work to show that actually this debate only takes place in the developed world, then it's very useful to tell the judges, given that, you know, we gave these points of rebuttal, what is left of their argument? It is actually only this. So not the huge burden that they set themselves up to prove, only the small benefit. Now let's compare that with our side, etc., etc. And the last thing to say, when I say that judges are happy to be swayed, is that clarity matters as well. Clarity is incredibly important in debating, and teamwork, therefore, is also really important. So we don't like to give points for structure, we don't like to give points for style, but it does matter that you have a team line that you can both agree on and that you make it very clear to the judges. So numbering your arguments, point 1, point 2, point 3, and labeling them as your conclusions rather than themes you're going to talk about. For example, saying, firstly, why we help children, secondly, why we help minorities, is much more compelling than saying children and minorities, or, you know, principle and practical. So always be very clear about your conclusions and the things you're pushing for. But equally importantly, teamwork matters and role fulfillment matters. So if you're in summary, don't let new material distract the judges. Don't get tempted to sneak something in last minute because it might win you the debate. Because if it's big enough that it does win you the debate, then it's probably going to be too new. And the best thing you can do in summary is to win with the material that your partner has put out on the table. That gives the judge a sense of consistency, and that helps them understand what it is that you are proving. There's been so many times when I've heard stories from judges, and this has happened to me as well, that you were very frustrated at having to give a team a third or a fourth, but you had to because you didn't know what their additions to the debate were, or you didn't know what their key arguments were. Obviously, judges will try to do that work for you, but you can't trust that they will always err in your favor. So always be very clear about what your addition is. Always be very clear about why it beats other teams in the debate, including your own top half or your own bottom half, if you get to make a claim in a point of information or something of the sort. So that's the last thing I would do. So as a recap, going through these things, between now and Euros, go through some of the tournaments that you've had recently with your partner and ask yourself, have you described where an argument exists without actually making it and explaining why an outcome is good or bad? Have you ever explained why something is likely but not provided any structural reasons for why it was more likely than not, and therefore let the other side say, no, that won't happen, the opposite will happen? Thirdly, have you ever exaggerated or generalized and tried to go for too big an impact that you couldn't prove? Fourthly, have you left your arguments unprotected and not forced the other team to take extra steps to be able to respond to it convincingly? Fifthly, have you engaged at a shallow level and forgotten to, you know, take a team at their best and rebut where the argument was heading rather than only rebutted what they had said so far? Sixthly, have you missed ways in which your argument can give a lot of very powerful material to the other side, or relied on a premise that you were negating in your rebuttal, for example? And lastly, were you not thinking strategically? Were you not thinking like a judge, and forgetting to ask yourself, what were the areas where you needed to prioritize your time, or the arguments that you needed to prioritize responding to? So that's a summary of what I would say as the key mistakes that I've seen people make very often in debating. Maybe not all of these apply, maybe not all of these are useful. Please do take them with a pinch of salt. But since there's no questions, the last thing that I would say is thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope that you're enjoying the workshops that we're running so far. We are going to keep them up, so please send me a message if there's something that we're missing, something that doesn't make sense, something else that we can do for you or your circuit. We are going to be running a lot more of these with Scottish Euros, and we really want to hear your thoughts. So if you want a workshop for your society or a workshop out in the open, just let us know. So I hope this is clear and this is useful. You've got the slides at the bottom, and I will also add a Google Doc at the bottom that has this in writing in case anything was unclear. And we very much look forward to seeing you all at Tallinn Euros. Thank you very much.